You drink water, and that's all of us. This next story should be of interest, most specifically if you are among the 300,000 or so customers of the Northern Kentucky Water District.
Lawsuits filed concerning drinking water some 300 miles away might have implications for Northern Kentuckians. Local 12's Jeff Hurst went to West Virginia to trace the source of the questions and has our investigative report.
It has controlled our life for years actually.
Earl and Gwen Botkin have a nice home near Parkersburg, West Virginia. He's a retired housing inspector, she's a housewife. Everything looks normal, but their normal is different because of Earl's health.
I spent 21 days in the hospital, and when they finally did release me, I came home for 10 days and had to go back for 3 more because there was complications again.
Earl has suffered since the early 90s. First, they thought he had cancer, then pinned it down to ulcerative colitis. Earl had his colon removed last year.
My life has been changed so bad, so much, because of this.
That's the DuPont chemical plant in Parkersburg. Earl Botkin is among 3,500 water customers in West Virginia and eastern Ohio pursuing legal claims against DuPont. The allegation: DuPont released a chemical called PFOA into the Ohio River, contaminating the drinking water source and making people like Earl Botkin very ill. Exposure to the toxic chemical PFOA, which is also known as C8, has been linked with probability to 6 diseases, including 2 forms of cancer and ulcerative colitis. That link, determined by an independent science panel which studied thousands of Parkersburg area water customers, is the basis for Earl Botkin's lawsuit. So how convinced are you that this chemical caused your issues?
I'm very much convinced because I can't find any other reason for me to have this problem.
So what does all of this have to do with Greater Cincinnati? Well, if you're here in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and you take a piece of wood and you throw it in the Ohio River, eventually it's going to go the 285 miles downstream to Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky. Well, the same thing is true with chemicals. You dump them in the river up here, eventually they end up where we live. And where many of us drink the water from the Ohio. Chemicals do dissipate as they move downriver, but not completely. PFOA was highest near the DuPont plant. But a study done for the National Institutes of Health says a facility 285 miles upriver from Cincinnati, that's DuPont, may represent a potential source of PFOA exposure via the Ohio River for us in Greater Cincinnati.
The DuPont company had been dumping this chemical into the Ohio River since the 1950s.
Northern Kentucky attorney Rob Ballott has been fighting DuPont for 15 years, winning a class action lawsuit which led to creation of the independent science panel and provided PFOA blood tests for 70,000 water users near Parkersburg. The settlement also let individual customers like Earl Botkin sue for damages. Rob Ballott has been repeatedly asking federal, state, and local agencies for similar PFOA monitoring for Northern Kentucky, calling it imperative to protect public health. Why? Because the scientific study for the National Institutes of Health found much higher levels of PFOA in a sample population of girls in Northern Kentucky, higher than the national average, including Cincinnati. So, one obvious question: why did that study find higher blood levels of PFOA in the girls here in Northern Kentucky than in girls right across the river in Cincinnati? The two places are not very far apart. It's the same Ohio River drinking water source, and it's the same PFOAs that the scientists suspect flowed downstream from West Virginia. The answers, say the NIH scientists, may be water treatment. For a quarter of a century, Cincinnati Water Works has had what's called granular activated carbon filtration, which removes PFOAs. Northern Kentucky, at the time of the study, did not. And even though the girls in question were tested a decade ago, the issue for PFOAs is still potentially relevant.
It stays in you for a long period of time.
Our Local 12 investigation continues after the break with more questions about whether Northern Kentucky water customers should be given blood tests. Now with the second part of our Local 12 investigation about drinking water.
Jeff Hirsch is looking at whether water quality lawsuits filed 300 miles up the Ohio River have implications for water customers in northern Kentucky.
It's important to point out that there are no measurable PFOAs in either Cincinnati or northern Kentucky drinking water now. The Northern Kentucky Water District installed the same carbon filters that Cincinnati has in 2012. But there's still a possible issue here. DuPont stopped manufacturing PFOAs in 2013, but the toxic chemical had been discharged into the Ohio River for half a century. And some of those PFOAs apparently flowed down here. The Northern Kentucky Water District says it did test the Ohio River here in 2007 and 2010 and found no PFOAs. However, Cincinnati Waterworks detected it 3 times between 2005 and 2007, and other federal and regional agencies found it a total of twice through 2011. Before 2005, nobody tested for PFOAs at all, no requirement to do so. Somebody born in the 50s could have been consuming PFOAs for 50 or 60 years.
That's possible. That's possible.
And there's something else. PFOAs have been turning up in drinking water around the country, New York State, Vermont, and other places. And so a few months ago, the U.S. EPA put out guidelines for maximum lifetime consumption of PFOA, which for northern Kentucky leads to a catch-22. Waterworks officials there have refused to call for blood tests, saying there's no provable need. But how do you know that unless you check? How can you determine if you've had something over your life unless you're tested?
Well, you really can't. That's the concern.
It is, of course, possible that there's no problem, or the higher PFOA levels in northern Kentucky girls came from something besides the water. The NIH scientists concede that could be. But they also say probably not, because PFOA in those test girls' blood was highly associated with cumulative years of drinking water from the Northern Kentucky Water Distribution Zone. That does not surprise Earl and Gwen Botkin, who once upon a time had never heard of PFOAs and once believed everything was okay with their water too.
You trusted the water.
Oh, of course. You think all your life you live in a country where surely the water's clean. We should be able to turn our water on and it'd be safe.
Even though hundreds of thousands of pounds of PFOA went into the Ohio River for 50 years and some of it flowed down here, government agencies are doing nothing about blood testing in northern Kentucky. The Northern Kentucky Water District told me to contact the Kentucky Division of Water and EPA. The U.S. EPA told me their new lifetime guideline for PFOA exposure, which also includes a companion chemical called PFOS, is calculated to protect the most sensitive populations, fetuses during pregnancy and breastfed infants. EPA also assumes that most exposure to PFOA and PFOS, 80%, is from sources other than drinking water, such as dust, air, and soil. That's in general nationwide. But the EPA's response misses the specific point about northern Kentucky, where the NIH study saw Ohio River drinking water as the most logical cause of higher PFOA levels. The EPA told Rob Ballott they do not have the authority or resources to offer blood testing and to contact the Kentucky Department of Health. It's been 2 months so far, no response from them. And the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet told Ballott the water is fine now, and the issue of PFOA blood testing for previous customers is not within their jurisdiction. So, summing up, the locals say ask the state or the feds say ask the state, and the state so far says it's not our job. Jeff Hirsch, Local 12 News.
Well, 2 water customers near the Parkersburg plant, clients of Rob Ballott, recently won lawsuits against DuPont. The juries awarded those customers around $7 million total. One of the customers has testicular cancer. The other has kidney cancer.
DuPont is appealing those verdicts, claiming there is no direct one-to-one link between PFOA and the illness of customers. In a general statement, a DuPont spokesperson told Local 12, quote, "At no time during the period PFOA was released from the DuPont facility did anyone at DuPont ever believe it was likely to harm anyone. These releases complied with the law and occurred with the full knowledge of regulators."
DuPont also says any risk associated with PFOA exposure is small, and there was not a higher incidence of disease surrounding the Parkersburg plant than in the general population. Meantime, 40 more lawsuits against DuPont from water customers near the plant are scheduled to go to trial between now and the end of next year, including one underway already.
If you would like to see more of the documents from the case, including more from DuPont, government agencies, and attorney Rob Botkin, you can go to our website, local12.com.
And that's all the time.